This was supposed to be a dream vacation, a peaceful getaway for a hard-working Black family just looking to relax. But in an instant, everything changed. They had barely unpacked their bags when flashing red and blue lights filled the air, cutting through the night like a warning. Confusion turned to shock as uniformed officers surrounded them, barking orders, hands hovering over their holsters. It didn't make sense. They had done nothing wrong. This was their vacation, their moment to breathe. The father, a respected business owner, raised his hands, trying to calm the situation. The teenage son stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. And the mother, she stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. She knew their rights. She knew the law better than anyone else. But these officers didn't see a family. They didn't see human beings. They saw something else. The tension in the air was suffocating. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, whispering among themselves. Cameras rolled. The officers demanded IDs, accused them of trespassing in the very place they had rented. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the mother revealed something that made the officers pause. She wasn't just any woman. She was a U.S. senator, a lawmaker, a person with power and influence. And yet, here they were, treated like criminals for simply existing in a space they had every right to be in. For the first time, doubt flickered across the officers' faces. But was it too late? Would the damage already be done? What happens next will shock you. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this disturbing encounter, because this story is far from over. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their grit on the situation slipping as the weight of their mistake began to sink in. But instead of admitting it, they doubled down. "Senator or not, we got a call about trespassers," one of them muttered, as if that justified everything. The mother, standing tall, kept her voice calm but firm. "A call from who?" she asked. "Because we have proof we belong here." She motioned toward her purse, moving slowly, knowing any sudden movement could escalate the situation. She pulled out the rental agreement, her name printed clearly at the top. The officers hesitated. It was undeniable proof. But instead of stepping back, one of them snatched the papers from her hands and barely glanced at them. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "We need to verify." The father's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "Verify what?" he asked. "We did everything right. We booked this place. We paid for it. We have the paperwork. What more do you need?" Their teenage son stood between them, his heart racing. He had seen stories like this on the news, heard the warnings from his parents about how to behave in moments like this. But nothing prepared him for the cold, hard reality of it happening to them. A small crowd had started to gather at a distance, whispers traveling through the night air. Some had their phones out, recording. The weight of what was unfolding pressed down on everyone. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. A man in a crisp polo shirt stepped out from the shadows. The property owner. "Officers, what's going on here?" he asked, his eyes darting between them and the family. For the first time, the officers looked unsure, but instead of stepping aside, they squared their shoulders. With handling a situation, one of them said, his tone sharp. The mother met the owner's eyes. "We rented this home. We have proof. Yet, we're being treated like criminals." The owner glanced at the paperwork still clutched in the officer's hands. His expression changed. "This is a mistake," he said. But the officers weren't backing down. Not yet. The property owner's words hung in the air, but the officers barely acknowledged him. They weren't ready to let this go, not yet. One of them, the tallest of the group, took a step closer to the father, his hands still resting near his holster. "We still need to run their IDs," he insisted. The mother took a slow breath, steadying herself. "You have our paperwork. We don't need to prove anything else," she said, her voice unwavering. She wasn't just defending her family, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been in this situation, forced to explain their existence when others never had to. The property owner, shifting uncomfortably, ran a hand through his hair. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Officers, I can personally vouch for them. I rented this place to them myself." He turned to the mother. "Senator, I'm so sorry about this." The title caught the attention of the growing crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. A senator? The very people sworn to uphold the law were now standing in defiance of it. Some onlookers shook their heads in disbelief. Others pulled out their phones to record. But the officers weren't ready to back down. The shorter one, his face tense, radioed in, murmuring something too low to hear. The mother caught the flicker of hesitation in his movements. Were they waiting for backup? Were they looking for a way out of this, or digging in deeper? Meanwhile, their son stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists. He felt trapped between fear and anger. His whole life, his parents had taught him how to handle moments like these. Stay calm, don't argue, don't make sudden moves. But why? Why do they have to be the ones to stay calm when they were the ones being wronged? Then, a woman's voice cut through the night. "Are you seriously doing this? You know who she is." The mother turned. A younger woman stood near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, phone in hand. Her voice trembled, but her outrage was clear. "You're caught, and you know it." For the first time, the officers hesitated. The weight of the moment was shifting, but would it be enough? Or were they too far gone to stop now? The air felt heavy, charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The officers stood rigid, their authority slipping as more eyes turned on them. The mother held her ground, her expression unreadable, but inside she was calculating. Every second that passed, every move they made, would decide what happened next. The father shifted slightly, placing a protective hand on their son's shoulder. He could feel the boy trembling, holding back emotions he wasn't sure how to process. This was supposed to be a trip filled with memories, laughing on the beach, late-night talks under the stars. Instead, this moment would be the one he would never forget. The officer who had spoken on the radio turned slightly, stealing a glance at his partner. They had a choice to make, and they knew it. Let them go and admit they had overstepped, or push forward, trying to regain control. The tension was unbearable. The woman in the crowd, the one who had called them out, took a bold step forward. "Why are you still here? You know they belong here. You know you messed up." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. More murmurs followed. A man shook his head, whispering to the person beside him. "This is bad, real bad." And then suddenly, another voice, this time from behind the officers. "What's going on here?" A new figure had arrived, a senior officer, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. He scanned the scene quickly, taking in the officers, the family, the growing crowd. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes settled on the mother. She met his gaze without flinching. "Your officers detained us without cause," she said, her voice steady. "We've proven we belong here, and yet they refuse to let us go." The senior officer exhaled sharply. He had heard enough. But before he could speak, the officer holding the rental papers took a step forward. "Sir, we received a call about trespassers, and they refused to comply." A beat of silence. Then the senior officer's gaze darkened. "You detained a senator." The shift was instant. The officers stiffened, their mistake now fully exposed. The crowd pressed in closer, waiting for what came next. The moment of truth had arrived. Would justice be served, or would they find a way to twist this even further? The senior officer's words hung in the air, heavy with realization. The two officers shifted uneasily, their faces tightening as they exchanged quick, silent glances. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were waiting to see if accountability would finally mean something. The mother stayed still, her hands steady at her sides, but inside, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her family, it was about the message this moment would send. But just as the senior officer opened his mouth to speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Hold on." A new figure stepped forward from behind the officers, a man in plain clothes, a sharp suit that looked out of place against the flashing police lights. His expression was unreadable, but the way the officers immediately straightened told her everything. This was someone with power. The senior officer's jaw clenched. "Detective Carter," he said, his voice edged with something close to frustration. The detective ignored him, his sharp eyes landing on the mother. "Senator," he said smoothly, nodding slightly, "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." The words were calculated. They weren't an apology, and they weren't an admission of wrongdoing. They were an attempt to defuse the situation without giving up control. The mother's lips pressed together. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "My family was harassed, detained without cause. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation." Detective Carter let out a slow breath, his hands sliding into his pockets. "We received a call," he said. "A report of suspicious individuals on this property. We have to take those calls seriously." The father let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Suspicious? We had luggage in our hands." His voice hardened. "You didn't see a family. You saw a problem." For a moment, the detective said nothing. Then his gaze flicked to the senior officer. "Let them go," he said, his tone firm. The crowd shifted, a murmur spreading through them. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right. It was too easy, too controlled. And then, just as the officers finally backed away, just as the family started to breathe again, the detective pulled out his phone. He turned slightly, lowering his voice, but the mother caught the words anyway. "Find out who made that call." Her stomach tightened. There was more to this. Someone had wanted them here, in this exact moment, in this exact situation, and she wasn't leaving until she found out why. The mother's breath steadied, but her mind raced. This wasn't over. The way Detective Carter had said those words, it wasn't just a routine check. There was intent behind it. Someone had wanted them here, trapped in this moment. But why? The officers stepped back, the tension easing, but the damage had already been done. The teenage son clenched his fists at his sides, anger and exhaustion weighing on him. The father exhaled, rubbing his temples, trying to process everything. And then the detective's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening. The mother caught the flicker of something, surprise, maybe even concern, before he masked it. He turned, stepping away, but she wasn't about to let him shut her out. "Who was it?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The detective hesitated, then sighed. The call came from inside the neighborhood. His eyes lifted to hers. A resident. The mother's stomach dropped. A neighbor. Someone had looked out their window, seen them, and decided they didn't belong. Her jaw clenched, a deep, burning frustration bubbling in her chest. How many times had this happened? How many stories just like this one had played out without cameras, without consequences? But then, another buzz. The detective's eyes narrowed. He answered, his voice low. A few seconds passed, then his entire posture shifted. His gaze snapped back to the officers, his tone sharp. "Pull up the caller's information." The officers hesitated, but one of them quickly moved to check his in-car computer. The crowd, once murmuring in uncertainty, fell into a hush, waiting. Then the officer's face went pale. He turned, swallowing hard. "Sir, the call was made from an unregistered burner phone." Silence. The mother's eyes narrowed. "A burner?" The detective exhaled slowly, rubbing his chin. This wasn't just a neighbor being nosy. Someone wanted you here, at this exact time, in this exact situation. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just profiling. It was targeted. Someone had orchestrated this. And whoever it was, they were still out there watching. The weight of the revelation settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. A burner phone, a staged call. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The mother's pulse quickened. Someone had set them up. The detective's expression hardened as he pieced it together. "This wasn't random," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. He turned back to the officer at the car. "Can you trace the last location of the phone before it disconnected?" The officer hesitated, typing quickly, then frowned. "It pinged off a tower near here," he muttered. "Could have been anyone within a few blocks." The mother's gaze swept over the faces in the crowd. Some looked horrified, some angry, but one thing was clear. Whoever had done this might still be watching. Then, movement. From the corner of her eye, she caught a shadow slipping away, a figure turning briskly down the street. It was quick, too quick, as if they had just realized they had stayed too long. Her instincts kicked in. "There," she said, pointing. The detective followed her line of sight, his body tensing. "Hey, stop," he called, breaking into a sprint. The crowd parted as he ran, the mother following close behind, her heart pounding. She wasn't going to let this person disappear into the night, not after everything they had just been through. The figure darted around a parked car, but the detective was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing the person by the arm and yanking them back. A startled yelp escaped as they stumbled into the streetlight's glow. The mother froze. The person wasn't some anonymous stranger. It was the property manager, the same man who had rented them the house. The father caught up, his face darkening. "You." The man's chest heaved, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. "I was just making sure everything was okay," he stammered, but the lie was thin, unraveling in real time. The detective's grip tightened. "Why did you make that call?" The man swallowed hard. His breath hitched. "I didn't think it would go this far. The mother's voice cut through the night. "You wanted us out." The man lowered his head, shame flickering across his face. "Some of the other homeowners, they don't like rentals. They don't like certain people staying here." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought if the police came, you'd just leave." The words stung. The ugliness of it, the casual cruelty. He hadn't expected this to turn into a public spectacle. He hadn't expected them to fight back. The detective exhaled, shaking his head. "You're coming with me." The crowd murmured in shock as he led the man away, the weight of the truth finally out in the open. But the mother didn't feel relief. Not yet. She turned to her family, to her son, who had witnessed all of this firsthand. His shoulders were squared, his face unreadable. She placed a hand on his back. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but his voice was quiet. "This happens all the time, doesn't it?" Her throat tightened. She wished she could tell him no. She wished she could say this was the last time. But all she could do was promise, "We'll keep fighting." And as the flashing lights faded into the night, she knew this was far from over. But tonight, they had won.